rediscover, record, and remember. Welcome to the Voices of Vanishing Places.
Yeah, hello.
Okay, hi.
Please introduce yourself to the audience.
Yeah, I'm Puay Peng. I'm a professor at the National University of Singapore. Been here for 10 years. So currently I also hold the chair, the UNESCO Chair on Architectural Heritage Conservation and Management in Asia. So my own research obviously is in several aspects, but more recently, like in the last 20 years, I've been doing work on conservation, both in China, Hong Kong, and now in Singapore, but also pushing the boundary of conservation and the practice of conservation, especially architecture conservation in Singapore.
And my first question is, I basically want to expand my own archive beyond just interviews, but also having more like educational and advocacy components as well. So with your extensive experience with translating like conservation practices to more of like these, like for example, like in NUS, like the curricula itself, or even in UNESCO and hands-on efforts, do you have any advice for how I can do the same for young people in Singapore as well?
Yeah, that is very important because I believe very much that heritage conservation is both top-down and bottom-up. And in many East Asian, like Korea, China, or even Singapore, a lot of decisions have been made top-down. So what to conserve, what to preserve, what to protect, that's all from the top. And that's not necessarily a bad thing, but there should also be very much ground-up involvement, both, as you say, in education and advocacy. And so I'm very interested in getting the youth, getting the young people interested in conservation and in heritage. I hope some of my students or my graduates would engage in various capacity, both working as a conservationist, but also perhaps might be able to do something like what you did, like in education, mass education, as well as advocacy. And that, I think, to me is very, very important. It has to be both top down and bottom up, so that the whole society is involved.
Right. Yeah, that's very interesting. And as you said before, I think there's like a difference in the type of efforts that's done either by the authority, that's more of like the policies, right?
Yes.
But then I think like what students like me can do is quite different than what the other political authorities can do.
Sure.
So what do you think are some like examples or ways that young students can do to preserve these heritages like in Singapore?
I feel that in Singapore, the bottom-up effort is still at its infancy. Very few young people, or even say recent graduates of the universities, like our program, very few of them are able to advocate for conservation. Probably unlike in Korea or in Hong Kong, where there's a lot more groundwork in terms of asking for conservation. And so I suppose there are many things that a young person can do in terms of advocacy. And obviously one is to really understand what is conservation and how we go about looking for conservation or assessing conservation projects or projects or buildings or even landscape that requires protection. So it goes by the value assessment, how we judge whether some objects or buildings or landscape is worthy of conservation. So that part is very important. So we are not conserving because we have a nostalgic feeling. Right? So for the young people, there's no such thing, right?
That's a really good point.
And so that's not how we start. In the classes that we had, we really want them to understand the scientific basis for conservation, and that could also be something that the young people can learn and can be educated. Right? So you read about history, you read about events happening, you read about social history, and you read about what really are important. Now, it might be possible, the one criterion that had always been used is the age of building. right? If this is more than 100 years old, then we should preserve it.
Right.
More than 200 years old, oh my God, I mean, it's just an old building, so we need to preserve it. But that's not necessarily the only criteria. There are many other criteria that we should use for conservation to judge for the significance of the building.
Right.
For example, we recently did not recently, but maybe 4 years ago, 3-4 years ago, did a study for URA locally to look at buildings, building clusters, so more than one building in Singapore that's worthy of preserving. And so the question I asked at that time is, well, can you define the age, right? So are we looking for buildings more than 50 years old, which is a kind of international standard, or say 60 years old and so on? And they said, no, maybe 30 years old. Because they have this long-term planning view that maybe in 10, 20 years' time, we really have to look at this heritage, right? We cannot destroy them and then 20 years later say, we lost something, right?
Right.
And so they are taking a very long view, and which is wonderful. So we were looking at buildings that are really more recent,
Right.
like built in the 90s. I mean, just before you were born. And so those are really a wonderful opportunity for us to look at other criteria, not just the age of buildings, and see how they might be significant. The other possible perspective is to see how the building meant to the society, to the community. Because this is really quite difficult, because everyone has a different view of buildings. And so we were helping URA again to look at the values of the Golden Mile complex. I'm not sure whether you know about that building, which is 1973, which is not very old, but it represents certain very significance. And a lot of buildings of the modern era, 70s, 80s, if you ask your parents, they are not sufficiently old, and because they are built with concrete, and sometimes they are really quite run down, you may say, no, why should we preserve this sort of buildings? Yeah, but sometimes the values lies in its both architecture but also communal. Because Golden Mile complex, for example, was used by the Thai people to promote their culture, to have their food, their supermarket, restaurants and all that, all in there. I suppose many of these sort of places might be overlooked by people because they are not old, they are not particularly grand. I mean, if you say, we look at the National Gallery, right? They are so grand, so we must preserve them. But other buildings are really quite common and relate to our everyday life. How do we look at them? Right? So the hawker centers in HDB estates, right? Shall we preserve them, or what do we do? Right? So what kind of values do they have? It is a way for us to understand what to preserve, and for the young people to raise their voice from their own perspective, from their own experience, what ought to be preserved.
Yeah, that's an interesting take. Another question is regarding my most recent interview with Mr. Raymond Wang, who was the chairman of the Tianda Temple. And during our interview, he talked about how there's a decreasing trend of devotees for the temple itself, and how he's hosting very multicultural events like Durian Festival or other events to kind of keep on preserving this temple as a communal thing, right? So have you ever seen similar strategies used by religious centers or any other heritage in Singapore as well?
Yeah, a lot of religious centers, especially the Chinese ones, lack young people participating in their activities. It's usually seen to be very old school and so belongs to the old age people. So that's a problem. So whether you create more activities to attract the young, that may be one way. The other type of buildings would be I don't know whether you know about clan association.
Oh.
So in the early days, with migrants coming from China
Uh-huh.
to Southeast Asia, people will form groups. So if you come from a village
Right.
somewhere in
Right,
China,
right.
you would like to gather together, and you bring more of your people from that village to Southeast Asia,
Right,
and
right.
so you form a kind of association, and it can be by surname, it can be by locality, correspond to the locality in,
Right,
in
in
China.
China.
And as you can see, I mean, it's impossible to keep that up
Right.
because young people now have no identity at all.
Oh.
Yeah, so I've been asking people, oh, what's your hometown? 3 generations ago, how do I know, right? Nobody has any idea of that before anymore. And so the association to them means zero.
Right, right.
So in Chinatown and many other places around the city, there used to be hundreds of associations, and now many closed down because there's no more people attending to their business. And so how to continue that kind of association, that kind of link to the past, and that is very difficult. Many would do a lot more cultural events and so on, and some the richer association like the Teochew one would offer scholarships for young people. Right? So at least there's a certain connection, right, for the young people to understand their background, to understand their the identity of their forebears, and so something of that nature, I think. But it's a big issue.
Right.
It's a big issue.
Right.
My take is that we cannot force identity. In our generation, these are the buildings that we feel are important to define our identity.
Right.
So we have to preserve it. But in terms of conservation practice, we are the custodian of this particular time. The next generation could have their own decision. Right? And if we feel that this sets of buildings, like in Singapore, we preserve more than 7,000 buildings. If this set of buildings are worthy of conservation, next generation, not your generation, should come out and say that, yes, among this set, maybe this we don't identify anymore, so they can go. But others, maybe we recognize the values, and maybe there are also new ones that want to add to the list. And so it's always
Adapting.
Adapting, and I always call conservation in motion. Motion not only like in action, but also it's all moving.
Right.
So moving. So you have to keep up with the time. You have to keep up with the time, and for buildings that are no longer relevant to your generation, then we have to find a way to say we may not keep the building, but we can keep the memory of the building. So it can be a documentation, it can be an archiving, so that can be kept somewhere. Then the next generation, if they are really interested, they can look for those information. But perhaps after 100 years, that can also be taken out because it's no longer relevant, right? So it's the relevance to the generation, and therefore young people's involvement is very important because you define what's relevant to you, and you also learn from the previous generation why they think those buildings are important.
Right.
And so back to your question, it is very difficult to force the conservation of a building when the audience is no longer there. And to me, my take is quite radical. I say, well, let it be, because you have to decide, not us, right, for the next generation.
Yeah, that makes sense.
Yeah, and if you decide not to keep it, then we have to find a way to keep the memory, maybe. With all this digital technology, you can do something very quickly, and that will be it.
And I think like the idea of conservation and preservation is like keep on emerging or discussion, but then that can look, I think, very different for different people. So like, how would you define how preservation look like for heritage?
As I say, the definition would be how relevant and how significant they are to you. Right? It's not about how old they are, how beautiful they are, how historic they are, how significant it is. It's about all this, but
Right.
also how they relate to you.
Right.
If there's no relation to you, then it's really not necessary to keep them. Yeah.
Right. So then, would preservation of, like, for example, like historic sites only be possible if we like preserve that like physical state, or do you think there's like other ways to preserve the heritage sites as
There
well?
are many ways of preserving, and obviously a lot of people will say that the physical state is the best, but the physical state or the physical building without any interpretation is as good as nothing. Yeah. So like you look at an object, if I don't tell you the story behind it, it's just an object. Right? If I tell you the story, it becomes meaningful.
Right.
It might relate to you.
Right.
So heritage interpretation is very important, and if you have proper interpretation, then there's a lot of digital means whereby you can preserve the building without preserving the actual building itself.
So I know that you currently are also holding as the UNESCO Chair of Asia. So for you, how do you think like you define preservation, or how do you think you have contributed to some preservation of historical sites?
So at two levels. One level is the kind of agency level or governance level. So how in my position and in my involvement with the different committees in the government, how I can push for the conservation agenda, so that it's not just preserve for preservation's sake, but perhaps better interpretation, better conservation technique, better way of preserving with the community, so what we call community participation,
Right.
And so on. Right? So that's one side. The other side would be to exchange experiences, doing actual projects and exchange like the conferences, like I went to Seoul, to Japan, to China, to Hong Kong, Thailand, and so on. So having this different exchanges, you see how people do things differently in different places. So I was involved in promoting conservation education in Cambodia, for example. So, but I have to work with them.
Right.
So every situation, every city, every country has its own cultural idiosyncrasy. So you have to work within that cultural context. You cannot do something and drop into that country. Right? And so everybody has a different perspective on what conservation is. While in Singapore, we talk about conservation of buildings of the 1990s. In Cambodia, their conservation concept is buildings of 990, 1,000 years earlier. Right? So that's their concept. So I say, hey, how come you just look at that? How about your colonial past? When you were under the French as a colony, there are several buildings that are really very, very well representative of that period, from the 1930s, 40s on. And they say, oh, maybe we should look at that as well. So they didn't even think about that. So their conservation is that, and ours is this. Right? But you need both, right? Yeah, we don't have anything that's 1,000 years old, but we have things that define our identity as a nation, right? In the nation building process. In Korea, I don't know how good is your Korean history. I got you there. Obviously, you know that there's a period of colonization by Japan, and what happened was many buildings from that period had gone, demolished. The palace in the middle of Seoul was once the governor's I don't know, office, very big building. I've seen that, and that's gone. And then the palace was built new. Right. So, in that process, you are working on decolonizing, right? Taiwan went through the colonization process the same time as Korea, but they kept all the Japanese buildings. Right? Even small buildings like the Shinto shrine,
Right.
they even kept them.
Right.
Right? So two societies under the same historic conditions
Right.
reacted differently today. Right?
So I've been trying to discover, like, similar to what you said, like any heritage sites that are either in danger or need more attention in Singapore. So based on your perspective, are there any heritage sites in Singapore that you believe deserves more attention from Singaporeans?
If you talk about buildings maybe from before 1950, most of them are covered
Right.
under the radar of URA and NHB. One or two buildings, very strangely in Singapore, there's a piece of land that belongs to the Sultan of Johor. It's not Singapore land, so we don't have the ownership. And that's next, right next to the Botanic Garden. And there's a building in there, or a couple of buildings, but one which is a house, a villa, for one of the members of the royal family from Johor. And that building is really very neglected. We cannot go in there, but from some of the images I saw, it's a very nice building. So that one is very exceptional. There's also this cemetery, the Bukit Brown. There's also a Gobi, Gobi's coffee, Gobi Suma coffee, Bukit. Is that Bukit Gobi or is that like a Gobi Mountain, Gobi Hill near Tua Payoh? That one is less attended to. Bukit Brown, there's a bit of no voices now, but that one has. And so, Singapore always go around and clear the cemetery because we need the land. But some of these are quite significant heritage because of the massiveness of the cemetery. So that's something. But I feel that perhaps anything that's after 1950s, there should be quite a few that is under the radar. And we can also extend the concept of conservation. In the past, we treat conservation as treating an object, right? So we look at how pretty the object is, so it's all object based. But nowadays, we look at conservation as a landscape. And so it's like the land, the landscape, together with the buildings, so in kind of totality.
Then I think this can be the last question of today. But like, for example, for me, my parents both, my dad had lived in Korea his entire life, and then my mom was kind of like moving between Hong Kong and Korea. Yeah.
Okay.
So I think that's why I have a very like multicultural background, which is pretty common among like international students in Singapore. So I think now is a question of like, how can we convince even the most multicultural people in Singapore that Singaporean heritage is still relevant to them as well? So how do you think we can make that connection between people?
Yeah, that's more difficult. What I normally do is to consider like cross-influencing. Right? If I look at a building here, and I can relate to it because I've seen that building, that sort of building somewhere in Hong Kong, in Seoul, in Busan, or somewhere else, then I would say, oh, I relate to that. Right? And that's either by American. That's either by looking at the trade routes between East Asia and Southeast Asia, and things get migrated and influencing each other, or that could also be kind of simultaneous development, especially in the modern period. of the architecture style, of the lifestyle, and so on. Many in Singapore we have very few industrial heritage, but in East Asia there are many factories that were built at the beginning of the 20th century and so on. So what we call industrial heritage would be very similar in different places, because industrialization started at the end of the 19th, early 20th century, and that affects many places in Asia. And if we can look at them and say that, yeah, there's this commonality, that might help the international students to understand what they are and so on. Now, obviously, the colonial period, we have a lot of buildings of the European architecture style, and that might also be some sort of relationship. Then lastly, probably the nation building, because even though Korea is a very ancient country, the more recent democratic Korea, you went through a period of nation building, and that is very important. And Singapore went through the same thing.
Right.
And so how do you relate to buildings and sites that relates to nation building? So it's not just a form, but the ideology, the meaning behind sites. So that could also be another way.
Yeah. All right. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thank you for listening. VVP will come back with more stories, more voices.